The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, silencing the crowd gathered outside Willow Creek's only saloon. Thomas Youngblood's aim was true as the tin can flew off the fence post, another in a long line of perfect shots that had earned him both respect and jealousy across the Montana Territory in 1879. The onlookers, mostly ranch hands, miners, and town folk, erupted in whistles and hollers, but Thomas barely acknowledged them. His eyes had drifted to Beatrice Callaway, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, clutching a basket of fresh herbs. "That's 20 in a row, Youngblood," shouted Miller, the saloon owner. "Never seen shooting like that since Wild Bill himself passed through these parts." Thomas holstered his Colt revolver with practiced ease and nodded toward Miller. "Just keeping my eye sharp," he said, his voice carrying the faint rasp that came from years of riding through dust storms and sleeping under open skies. "You could have any job you want," called out Jenkins, a wealthy cattle baron who'd been trying to hire Thomas as his personal enforcer for months. "Name your price." But Thomas's attention remained on Beatrice, with her auburn hair peeking out from beneath a simple bonnet and her dress plain, but well-kept, setting her apart from the painted ladies, who were watching the exhibition from the saloon's porch. "I've already got work," Thomas replied, finally turning to Jenkins. "The Callaway place needs help." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Doc Wallace, who'd had too much whiskey despite the early hour, spoke up. "The Callaway place, that dried-up patch of nothing. Why would a man with your talents waste time there?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He walked over to Beatrice, who looked down at her basket as he approached. "Ready to head back, Miss Callaway?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. "Yes, Mr. Youngblood," she said softly. "Pa's waiting on these herbs for his chest." More laughter followed, and someone called out, "They say her pa's got 1 foot in the grave already. You fixing to court a soon-to-be orphan girl with nothing to her name but a broken-down farm." "That's exactly what he's doing," another voice joined in. "They say she can't even make biscuits without burning them." Beatrice's cheeks flushed crimson, but she held her head high. Thomas turned to face the crowd, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "They laughed when he chose her," Jenkins said, addressing the crowd with a theatrical gesture. "The fool's throwing away his future." Thomas's hand didn't move toward his gun, but something in his stance made the laughter die quickly. "You'll see why I did," he said calmly, loud enough for all to hear. "A man looks for more than what's on the surface if he's got any sense at all." He offered his arm to Beatrice, who hesitated before taking it. Together they walked toward his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood apart from the other mounts tied at the hitching posts. "You shouldn't have done that," Beatrice whispered as they moved out of earshot of the crowd. "Now they'll talk even more." "Let them," Thomas replied, helping her up onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Words don't mean much coming from men who have never looked beyond what's easy to see." As they rode away from Willow Creek, the whispers and theories followed them like dust in their wake. No one understood why Thomas Youngblood, the best shot in 3 territories, a man who could have had his pick of positions or women, would choose to work for almost nothing at the failing Callaway farm, or why his eyes softened when they landed on plain, quiet Beatrice. But Thomas knew. And soon enough, so would everyone else. The ride to the Callaway farm took nearly an hour, winding through golden prairie grass that swayed in the late summer breeze. Beatrice sat stiffly in front of Thomas, trying to maintain as much distance as propriety would allow while sharing a saddle. "You don't need to be embarrassed," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Those men in town don't know the first thing about you." Beatrice sighed. "They know enough. They know Pa's farm is failing. They know I've turned down 3 offers of marriage because I can't leave him. They know what they see on the surface, Thomas interrupted. Just like they look at me and see nothing but a gun. The Callaway farm came into view, a modest cabin with a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a small corral with 2 old mares, and fields that had once been fertile but now struggled against the drought that had plagued the region for 2 summers. It wasn't much, certainly nothing compared to the Jenkins spread or even the smaller ranches surrounding Willow Creek. But Thomas noted the neat repairs, the careful maintenance that spoke of pride despite hardship. As they approached, Harold Callaway emerged from the cabin, leaning heavily on a walking stick. At 58, he looked 20 years older, his frame gaunt from the lung sickness that had taken hold the previous winter. "You're back later than I expected," he called out, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. Thomas dismounted and helped Beatrice down. "My fault, sir. Got caught up in town." Harold's sharp eyes missed nothing. "More showing off with that 6-shooter, I imagine." "Pa," Beatrice chided gently, "Mr. Youngblood was kind enough to escort me home." "And I appreciate it," Harold acknowledged with a nod to Thomas. "Though I still don't understand why a man like you is wasting his time helping us bring in what little crop we've managed this year." Thomas led his horse to the water trough. "I told you, Mr. Callaway, I'm tired of the life I was living, want something quieter for a while." Harold didn't look convinced but didn't press further. "Well, the north field needs clearing today if we're going to start planting next week." "I'll get to it right away," Thomas replied. Beatrice followed her father into the cabin, pausing at the door to look back at Thomas. Their eyes met briefly before she disappeared inside. The north field was overgrown with weeds that had taken advantage of the Callaway's inability to work the land properly. Thomas removed his jacket and gun belt, hanging them carefully on a fence post before picking up the scythe. The work was grueling, especially under the hot afternoon sun, but he welcomed it. Physical labor kept his mind from wandering to places he'd rather forget. He'd been working for about an hour when he felt someone watching him. Turning, he saw Beatrice standing at the edge of the field with a jug of water. "Pa's resting," she said, approaching him. "I thought you might be thirsty." Thomas took the jug gratefully, drinking deeply. "Thank you." Beatrice didn't leave immediately as he expected. Instead, she stood watching him, a question clearly on her mind. "What is it?" he prompted. "Why are you really here, Mr. Youngblood?" she asked directly. "We both know it's not for the meager wages Pa can afford to pay you." Thomas wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Maybe I'm tired of being known only for my shooting. There are easier ways to change that than breaking your back in our fields." "True enough." Thomas handed the jug back to her, "but none that interested me as much." Beatrice's cheeks colored slightly. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything, Miss Callaway," Thomas said gently. "Except that sometimes a man needs to prove to himself that he's more than what others see. Just as I suspect you're tired of being seen as only the dutiful daughter or the struggling farmer's plain girl." Her eyes widened at his perception. "You don't know me well enough to make such assumptions." "No," he agreed, "but I'd like to." Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the road toward the farm, and Thomas immediately recognized Jenkins and 2 of his men. "Stay here," he told Beatrice, moving to retrieve his gun belt. "No," she said firmly. "This is our land, I won't hide." Thomas didn't argue. By the time Jenkins and his men reached them, he had his gun belt back on, though he made no move to draw his weapon. "Youngblood," Jenkins called out, reining in his horse. "Been thinking about our conversation in town." "Didn't realize we had one," Thomas replied evenly. Jenkins dismounted, revealing his impressive height and girth. A self-made man who'd built his cattle empire through equal parts hard work and ruthlessness. He wasn't used to being refused. "I'm doubling my offer," Jenkins said. "You come work for me, and I'll throw in a parcel of good grazing land. You could start your own place, be more than a hired gun." Thomas felt Beatrice tense beside him. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Jenkins, but I'm employed here for now." Jenkins's eyes flicked to Beatrice, then back to Thomas. "For how long?" "Until old Callaway dies and leaves his daughter with debts she can't pay." "You think that's doing her a kindness, Mr. Jenkins?" Beatrice's voice was sharp with indignation. "My father's health and our financial affairs are none of your concern." Jenkins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, Miss Callaway, they are. Your father borrowed money from me last spring for seed. That loan comes due at harvest, which, by the looks of things, won't be bountiful." Thomas glanced at Beatrice, whose face had gone pale. This was news to her. "How much?" Thomas asked. $300 plus interest," Jenkins replied smugly. "An impossible sum for a small farm that was barely producing enough to feed its owners, let alone turn a profit." "We have until harvest," Beatrice said, her voice steadier than her expression. "You'll get your money." Jenkins chuckled. "I admire your optimism, Miss Callaway, but we both know that's unlikely. Of course, there are other ways to settle the debt. I'm a widower in need of a housekeeper. The position would include room and board for both you and your father." The implication was clear, and Thomas felt a surge of anger. "Like I said," he interjected, stepping slightly in front of Beatrice, "Miss Callaway has until harvest, and you'll get your money." Jenkins's expression hardened. "You planning to pay her debts, Youngblood?" "Didn't think gun work paid that well these days." "What I do with my money is my business," Thomas replied. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to finish before sundown." For a moment, it seemed Jenkins might press the issue, but after a tense silence, he remounted his horse. "Harvest is in 6 weeks," he said. "I'll be back then for my money or for other arrangements." As the 3 riders departed, Beatrice let out a shaky breath. "I didn't know about the loan," she said quietly. "Pa never told me." Thomas turned to her. "Would it have changed anything if he had?" She shook her head. "No, we needed the seed, but I would have." She trailed off, looking out at the fields they'd managed to plant, the crops struggling in the dry soil. "You would have worried more," Thomas finished for her. "Your father was protecting you the only way he knew how. And now?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Who's going to protect us from Jenkins?" Thomas picked up the scythe again. "Let me worry about Jenkins. You just help your father get well enough to see this harvest come in." As he returned to clearing the field, Thomas was acutely aware of Beatrice watching him, her expression a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and something else he couldn't quite name. He'd meant what he said he would handle Jenkins, but he hadn't shared the full reason he'd come to the Callaway farm in the first place. Some debts couldn't be paid with money, and Thomas Youngblood had been carrying his for far too long. The next morning dawned with a rare cloud cover that promised the possibility of rain, a blessing in the drought-stricken territory. Thomas had spent the night in the barn, as he had every night since arriving at the Callaway farm 2 weeks prior. He rose before sunrise, tending to his horse and the Callaway's mares before heading to the well to wash up. He was surprised to find Beatrice already there, drawing water. "You're up early," he observed, keeping a respectful distance. She nodded, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he hadn't seen before. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get an early start on the baking. Despite what they say in town about your biscuits." He teased gently. To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face. "They're not wrong. I'm a terrible baker, but I keep trying," Thomas smiled. "Persistence is an admirable quality." "So is honesty," she countered, studying him. You still haven't told me why you're really here, Mr. Youngblood. Thomas, he corrected. If we're going to be working side by side, you might as well use my given name. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. Thomas, then, and you can call me Beatrice when my father isn't around. He's particular about proprieties. As he should be, Thomas acknowledged. Your father seems like a good man. He is, she said softly. The best I've known, which is why I can't bear to see him worry about Jenkins's loan. She paused, weighing her next words carefully. If you know of any way we can raise that money before harvest. Thomas lifted the heavy water bucket for her. I might have some ideas, but first, let's focus on making this farm as productive as possible. No sense borrowing trouble before we have to. Together they walked back to the cabin, where smoke was already rising from the chimney. Harold was up and about, moving slowly but with determination as he prepared for the day. Morning, he greeted them, eyeing the way Thomas carried the water bucket for his daughter with a mixture of approval and wariness. Looks like we might get some rain today. We could use it, Thomas agreed, setting the bucket down. Harold nodded toward the west field. Thought we might try to get that section turned over today if you're willing. Soil's been too hard, but if rain's coming. I'll start right after breakfast, Thomas assured him. The morning passed in quiet industry. The promised rain arrived, a gentle, steady fall that soaked into the parched earth without washing anything away, perfect for farming. Thomas worked the plow while Harold directed from the edge of the field, occasionally offering advice on the lay of the land. By midday, the rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and glistening. Beatrice brought them a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and cold cider. I've been thinking, Harold said as they ate beneath the shelter of a lone oak tree. About Jenkins. Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Beatrice. What about him? I know he came by yesterday. Beatrice told me. Harold's weathered face showed no fear, only resignation. He's right that we won't be able to pay by harvest, not with what we've planted. Pa will find a way, Beatrice insisted. Harold shook his head. I've been prideful, trying to work this land like I did when I was younger and your mother was alive. Maybe it's time to accept Jenkins's offer. Not the housekeeping position, he added quickly, seeing Beatrice's expression. But he's been wanting to buy this land for years. It adjoins his eastern pasture. This land has been in our family for 3 generations, Beatrice protested. You can't just give it up. Better to sell it than lose it to debt, Harold reasoned. At least that way we'd have something to start over with somewhere else. Thomas set down his cup. What if there was another option? Both Callaways looked at him expectantly. I have some savings, Thomas said carefully. Enough to cover the loan and then some. I could invest in this farm, become a partner rather than just a hired hand. Harold's pride was immediately evident in his stiffened posture. We don't need charity, Youngblood. It's not charity, it's an investment, Thomas countered. This land has potential. With proper funds for irrigation and better seed, plus my labor alongside yours, we could turn it around in a year or 2. And what would you get out of it? Harold asked suspiciously. Thomas met his gaze steadily. A place to belong, a purpose beyond what I've had. And a future I can be proud of. His eyes briefly flickered to Beatrice, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. Harold caught the look and frowned. If you're thinking my daughter comes with this arrangement, Pa, Beatrice exclaimed, mortified. I'm thinking nothing of the sort, Thomas said firmly. This is a business proposal, pure and simple. Miss Callaway's hand is her own to give if and when she chooses. Harold studied him for a long moment. Let me think on it, he finally said. It's not a decision to make lightly. Thomas nodded, respecting the older man's caution. Of course, the offer stands whenever you're ready to discuss it further. As they finished their meal and prepared to return to work, Beatrice pulled Thomas aside. "That's a generous offer," she said quietly, "but I have to ask again why." "You barely know us." Thomas paused, considering how much to reveal. "Let's just say I'm trying to balance accounts from long ago." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that sometimes life gives you a chance to make right what once went wrong. I'm taking mine." Before she could question him further, he returned to the field, leaving Beatrice more confused than ever about the enigmatic man who had ridden into their lives. That evening, as Thomas was finishing his chores in the barn, Beatrice appeared in the doorway, a lantern in hand. The golden light cast her features in a soft glow that emphasized the delicate line of her jaw and the determination in her eyes. "My father would like to speak with you," she said. "About your proposal." Thomas nodded, hanging up the curry brush he'd been using on his horse. "I'll be right there." "Before you come," Beatrice added, stepping fully into the barn, "I want to know what you meant today, about balancing accounts from long ago." Thomas sighed, recognizing that he couldn't delay this conversation any longer. "Your father's name was familiar to me when I first heard it in town. It took me a while to place it, but eventually I remembered." "Remembered what?" "During the war, I was just a boy, no more than 16, though I lied about my age to enlist," Thomas began. "I was with a Confederate unit in Tennessee when I was badly wounded. Union soldiers found me, and instead of leaving me to die or taking me prisoner, one of them carried me to a field hospital. He stayed with me, made sure I got treatment. That man was Callaway." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Pa never talked much about the war." "Most men don't," Thomas acknowledged. "But I never forgot his name or his face. When I heard there was a Callaway struggling with a farm outside Willow Creek, I had to see if it was the same man. It was." "So this is about repaying a debt?" Beatrice asked, trying to understand. "He saved my life," Thomas said simply. "At great risk to his own, crossing lines to help an enemy soldier. I've spent years wondering what became of him, when I found out and saw the situation he was in." He shrugged. "It seemed like fate had finally given me the chance to return the favor." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, absorbing this revelation. "Does he know that you're the same boy?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't think he recognizes me. It was a long time ago, and I was half dead when he found me. I've changed a lot since then." "Why haven't you told him?" "I wasn't sure how," Thomas admitted. "And I wanted to help based on who I am now, not who I was then. Your father's a proud man. He might not accept help if he thinks it's only because of what happened during the war." Beatrice studied him in the lantern light. "There's more to you than meets the eye, Thomas Youngblood. I could say the same about you, Beatrice Callaway." A moment of understanding passed between them, something deeper than words could express. Then Beatrice turned toward the door. "We shouldn't keep Pa waiting," she said softly. In the cabin's small main room, Harold sat at the table, a sheet of paper before him. He looked up as they entered, his shrewd eyes taking in their expressions. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said without preamble, "and I've drawn up some terms that might be acceptable to me." Thomas took the seat across from him. "I'm listening." "A third share of the farm," Harold proposed, "in exchange for enough money to pay off Jenkins and invest in improvements. You'll continue to work the land alongside me, and all decisions regarding the farm will be made jointly." Thomas nodded. "That sounds fair." "There's more," Harold continued. "This arrangement is strictly business. My daughter is not part of the deal, as I made clear earlier." "Understood and agreed," Thomas said firmly. "And finally," Harold added, "if at any point you decide to move on, you'll give us first opportunity to buy back your share." Thomas considered this last condition. "Provided you can match any other offers I might receive." Harold's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You drive a hard bargain, Youngblood," But yes, that's acceptable. Then we have a deal, Thomas said, extending his hand across the table. Harold shook it, his grip still surprisingly strong. I'll have the papers drawn up properly in town next week. In the meantime, Thomas said, reaching into his vest pocket and withdrawing a leather pouch, this should cover the immediate needs. He placed the pouch on the table. The clink of coins indicated its substantial contents. Harold didn't reach for it immediately. You came prepared. I try to be, Thomas replied simply. Finally, Harold took the pouch. We'll use this wisely. First to secure better seed for the south field, then to repair the irrigation channel. As the men discussed specific improvements, Beatrice quietly prepared coffee. She brought cups to the table, her fingers brushing Thomas's as she set his down. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider before. The business arrangement was settled, but Thomas knew that the most important parts of his journey at the Callaway farm were just beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, the farm underwent a transformation. With Thomas's funds, they hired 2 local boys to help with the heavier work, purchased better tools, and repaired the irrigation system that had fallen into disrepair. Harold, energized by the new possibilities, seemed to gain strength daily, though his cough remained. The town's attitude shifted as well. When Thomas and Beatrice went to Willow Creek for supplies, the same people who had laughed now watched with curiosity and, in some cases, newfound respect. The fact that Thomas had invested his money in the Callaway place, rather than drinking or gambling it away, caused many to reevaluate their opinions of both him and the farm's prospects. Jenkins, however, was not pleased. He cornered Thomas outside the general store one afternoon while Beatrice was inside selecting fabric for new curtains. "Heard you've become a farmer now," Jenkins said, his tone making the word sound like an insult. "Quite a change from your previous line of work." Thomas continued loading supplies into the wagon. "Change can be good. You know, my offer still stands," Jenkins persisted. "I could use a man with your skills, and I pay better than dirt farming ever will." "I appreciate the offer," Thomas replied evenly, "but I'm content where I am." Jenkins's friendly facade slipped. "Is that so? Content playing house with old Callaway and his plain daughter? There are prettier women in town who'd be happy to warm your bed without requiring marriage." Thomas stopped what he was doing and turned to face Jenkins directly. "Mr. Jenkins, I respect your position in this community, but I won't stand for disrespectful talk about the Callaways. Not from you or anyone else." Jenkins smirked. "Touchy, aren't we? Makes me wonder what's really going on at that farm. People are talking, you know." A single man living so close to an unmarried woman, even with her father present. It's raising eyebrows. "People should mind their own business," Thomas said, his voice dangerously soft. "Business is exactly what interests me," Jenkins countered. "The Callaway land has the best water access in the eastern section of the valley. I've wanted it for years. Harold was close to selling before you showed up." "Well, now he doesn't need to sell," Thomas pointed out. "So I suggest you set your sights elsewhere." The conversation might have escalated further, but Beatrice emerged from the store at that moment, her arms full of packages. Seeing Jenkins, she hesitated briefly before approaching the wagon. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged politely, "I trust you're well." Jenkins tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Callaway, I'm very well, thank you, just discussing business with your employee here." "Partner," Thomas corrected. "I'm a partner in the Callaway farm now." Jenkins's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Well, partnerships can be dissolved as easily as they're formed. Remember that, Youngblood." With a final nod to Beatrice, he strode away. "What was that about?" Beatrice asked as Thomas helped her into the wagon. "Jenkins being Jenkins," Thomas replied, climbing up beside her. "He's not happy about losing his chance to acquire your land." Beatrice frowned. "He's a powerful man in these parts. It's not wise to make him an enemy." "I don't intend to," Thomas assured her, "but I won't let him intimidate us either." As they drove back toward the farm, Beatrice was quieter than usual. Finally, she said, "People are talking about us, aren't they? About you living at the farm." Thomas glanced at her. "People always talk. It doesn't matter. It matters to me," she said firmly. "I've always maintained my reputation in this community. I don't want that to change now." Thomas considered her words carefully. "What would you suggest? That I find lodging in town?" "No," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "That would be impractical for the farm work, but perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued, "Perhaps we should clarify the nature of our arrangement to others." "And what is the nature of our arrangement, Beatrice?" Thomas asked softly. Their eyes met, and the question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice looked away first. "You're my father's business partner," she said, her voice not entirely steady. "And a friend to our family." Thomas nodded, accepting her definition even as he recognized the boundaries she was establishing. "Then that's what we'll tell anyone who asks." They completed the journey in companionable silence, but something had shifted again. A door had been acknowledged, even if neither was ready to open it yet. Back at the farm, they found Harold sitting outside, watching the hired boys dig a new drainage ditch. He looked better than he had in months, his cheeks showing a hint of healthy color. "Productive day in town," he called as they approached. "Very," Beatrice replied, showing him the packages. "I got everything on our list, plus material for new curtains in the front room." Harold nodded approvingly. "The place could use some brightening up. And what about you, Youngblood? Any news worth sharing?" Thomas began unloading the wagon. "Grain prices are holding steady. The railroad spur to Helena should be completed by spring, which might open up new markets for us." "Good, good," Harold said, then lowered his voice as Beatrice went inside with her purchases. "And what about Jenkins? I assume you ran into him." Thomas wasn't surprised by Harold's perception. "He's not happy about our partnership." "He wouldn't be," Harold agreed. "Been trying to get this land for 5 years now. Offers got more aggressive after my wife passed and my health started failing." He coughed, a reminder that his recovery was still tentative. "Man like Jenkins doesn't take disappointment well." "I can handle Jenkins," Thomas assured him. Harold studied him thoughtfully. "I believe you can, but at what cost? Your reputation in these parts was as a gunman before you came here. I hope you're not planning to return to those ways on my account." "No, sir," Thomas said firmly. "Those days are behind me." "Good," Harold nodded. "Because my daughter seems to be developing a certain regard for you, and I wouldn't want to see her hurt." Thomas nearly dropped the sack of flour he was carrying. "Sir, I've been nothing but respectful toward Miss Callaway." "I know that," Harold said. "I'm not blind, though. I see the way you look at each other when you think I'm not watching. I'm not saying I disapprove. You've proven yourself a hard-working, honorable man these past weeks. But Beatrice has had her share of disappointments. She deserves someone who will stand by her through whatever comes." "I agree completely," Thomas said, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. Harold seemed satisfied with what he saw. "Well then, let's get these supplies put away before sunset." The boys have made good progress on that drainage ditch, should help with the flooding in the lower field come spring thaws. As they worked side by side, Thomas reflected on Harold's words. The man was more observant than he'd given him credit for, and apparently more open to the possibility of a relationship between Thomas and Beatrice than Thomas had assumed. The realization was both encouraging and daunting. That evening, after a simple but satisfying supper, Harold retired early, leaving Thomas and Beatrice alone by the fire. She was sewing, her nimble fingers working a needle through the new curtain fabric, while Thomas cleaned his revolver, a habit he maintained even though he rarely wore the weapon anymore except when going to town. "Pa seems better," Beatrice observed, breaking the comfortable silence. Thomas nodded. "The doctor in town thinks the new tonic is helping, and having hope for the farm's future probably doesn't hurt either. He was ready to give up before you came," she admitted, her eyes on her stitching. "I've never seen him like that, not even after Mother died." "He's a strong man," Thomas said. "Stronger than he gives himself credit for." Beatrice set down her sewing to stoke the fire. "You never did tell me how you know so much about farming. You clearly weren't always a gunman." Thomas set his cleaned revolver aside. "I grew up on a farm in Kentucky. My father taught me everything he knew before the war took him. Afterward, there wasn't much left of our place, so I headed west like so many others." "How did you end up making your living with a gun?" Thomas's expression grew distant. "It wasn't by choice, at least not at first. I was robbed of what little I had shortly after crossing the Mississippi. Found work with a cattle drive, learned to shoot to protect the herd from rustlers. One thing led to another, and eventually I gained a reputation. The pay was good, and it seemed easier than starting over from nothing." "But you weren't happy," Beatrice observed. "No," he agreed. "I wasn't. Each job took me further from the kind of man I wanted to be." Beatrice studied him in the firelight. "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who builds something lasting," Thomas said quietly. "The kind who leaves the world better than he found it. Like my father," she said with a hint of pride. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "Like your father." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and for a moment it seemed as if one of them might bridge that gap. But then Harold's cough echoed from the back room and the moment passed. "I should check on him," Beatrice said, rising quickly. "And I should turn in," Thomas added, gathering his gun cleaning supplies. "Early start tomorrow if we want to finish that north section." "Good night, Thomas," she said softly as she moved toward her father's room. "Good night, Beatrice," he replied, watching her go and wondering how many more nights would pass before he found the courage to tell her everything that was in his heart. The next day brought unexpected visitors. Thomas was working in the far field when he spotted a cloud of dust on the road approaching the farm. Shading his eyes, he could make out at least 5 riders. Instinctively, his hand moved to his hip, but he wasn't wearing his gun belt, hadn't worn it regularly since settling into farm work. He quickly signaled to one of the hired boys. "Ride to the house. Tell Miss Callaway and Mr. Callaway we have company coming, then stay with them until I get there." The boy nodded and took off at a gallop. Thomas followed more slowly, cutting across the fields to intercept the visitors before they reached the house. As he drew closer, he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Dawson from Willow Creek, accompanied by his deputy and 3 men Thomas didn't know. The sheriff raised a hand in greeting as they approached. "Youngblood," he called out, "need a word with you." Thomas stopped, waiting for them to reach him. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" Dawson, a fair but no-nonsense lawman who had been sheriff of Willow Creek for nearly a decade, dismounted. "Got some questions about an incident in Colorado last year. These gentlemen are from the territorial marshal's office." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach but kept his expression neutral. "What incident would that be?" one of the strangers, a hard-faced man with a marshal's badge, spoke up. "Shooting in Silverton. Man named James Watterson was killed. Witnesses say you were involved." I was in Silverton last year, Thomas acknowledged carefully, but I don't recall anyone being killed while I was there. That's funny, the marshal said, not sounding amused at all, because we have a sworn statement from a saloon girl who says different. Says you shot Watterson after a card game went bad. Thomas shook his head. She's mistaken. I played cards with Watterson, yes. He lost badly and made some threats, but he was very much alive when I left town the next morning. So you're saying he was killed after you left? The marshal pressed. I'm saying I don't know what happened to him after I left, Thomas clarified. If he was killed, it wasn't by my hand. The conversation might have continued in this vein, but at that moment, Beatrice arrived, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the yard. Harold followed more slowly, leaning on his walking stick. "Sheriff Dawson," Beatrice greeted him. "Is there a problem?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Just following up on some inquiries, Miss Callaway. Nothing for you to worry about." The marshal was less diplomatic. "We're investigating a murder, madam, and your friend here is a person of interest." Beatrice's eyes widened, but to Thomas's surprise, she didn't step away from him. Instead, she moved closer, as if physically demonstrating her support. "There must be some mistake," she said firmly. "Mr. Youngblood has been working with us for nearly 2 months now. He's a respectable businessman and partner in our farm." The marshal raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, partnership or not, we need to get to the bottom of this. Youngblood, I'd like you to come to town with us to make a formal statement." Thomas nodded. "Of course. Let me just get cleaned up and now would be better," the marshal interrupted. Harold stepped forward. "Surely you can allow the man to wash up and change his clothes before dragging him to town. We'll vouch for him," the sheriff interceded. "That's reasonable. We'll wait." As Thomas walked to the barn where he kept his few possessions, Beatrice fell into step beside him. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "What they're saying?" Thomas stopped, turning to face her fully. "No, I didn't kill James Watterson or anyone else in Silverton. I've used my gun when necessary, but never murdered anyone." Beatrice searched his face. "I believe you," she finally said. "But why would someone accuse you?" Thomas sighed. "I have enemies. Men who didn't like losing to me, either with cards or guns. And Watterson had connections. His brother is a wealthy mine owner. If James was killed, his brother would want someone to blame. What will you do?" "Go with them, answer their questions, clear my name," Thomas said simply. "The truth is on my side." Beatrice nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Be careful, and come back to us." The quiet plea in her voice made Thomas's heart tighten. "I will," he promised. 20 minutes later, washed and dressed in his better clothes, Thomas rode away with the lawman. He glanced back once to see Beatrice and Harold standing together in the yard, watching him go, a tableau of the life he had begun to build and now feared might be slipping away. In town, the questioning lasted for hours. The marshal was thorough, circling back to the same points repeatedly, trying to catch Thomas in a contradiction. But Thomas's story remained consistent. Yes, he had played cards with Watterson. Yes, there had been harsh words exchanged when Watterson lost heavily. No, he had not shot the man. Yes, he had left town early the next morning, but not because he was fleeing a crime. He'd had business elsewhere. "The timing is mighty convenient," the marshal observed. "Watterson was found dead the same morning you left town." "Coincidence, not convenience," Thomas countered. "I had no reason to kill him. He lost fair and square, and while he made threats, I didn't take them seriously. He was drunk and bitter, nothing more. Yet someone put a bullet in his back as he was walking home," the marshal said. "Someone who knew how to shoot." "Half the men in Silverton knew how to shoot," Thomas pointed out. "And if I had wanted to kill him, I wouldn't have shot him in the back." This gave the marshal pause. It was true that Thomas's reputation, while that of a dangerous man, had never included cowardice or back shooting. Sheriff Dawson, who had been mostly silent during the questioning, finally spoke up. "Marshal, I've known Youngblood since he came to this territory. He's had his share of trouble, but he's always been straight. If he says he didn't do it, I'm inclined to believe him." The marshal frowned. "Your opinion is noted, Sheriff, but this investigation will proceed based on evidence, not character references." Just then, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and to everyone's surprise, Jenkins walked in. "Gentlemen," he greeted them smoothly, "I heard there was some trouble concerning Mr. Youngblood here, and I thought I might be of assistance." Thomas tensed, suspecting that Jenkins's appearance meant nothing good for him. "This is an official investigation, Mr. Jenkins," the marshal said. "Unless you have relevant information—" "Oh, but I do," Jenkins interrupted. "You see, I happened to be in Silverton myself last year, around the same time as this unfortunate incident. Business interests, you understand. And I distinctly recall seeing Mr. Youngblood in the company of the deceased on the evening in question." Thomas stared at Jenkins in disbelief. "That's a lie. You weren't in Silverton." Jenkins smiled thinly. "I most certainly was, and I'm prepared to testify to what I saw." The marshal's interest was piqued. "And what exactly did you see, Mr. Jenkins?" "I saw these two men arguing bitterly after a card game," Jenkins said smoothly. "Watterson accused Youngblood of cheating, and Youngblood threatened him, said he'd regret making such accusations. I left before things escalated further, but when I heard about Watterson's death the next day, I had my suspicions. Yet you never reported this until now." Sheriff Dawson asked skeptically. Jenkins shrugged. "It wasn't my business and I had no proof. But now that official inquiries are being made, I felt it was my duty to come forward." Thomas could hardly contain his anger. "This is absurd. Jenkins is lying because he wants the Callaway farm. He knows that with me gone, Harold will have no choice but to sell to him." "That's quite an accusation, Youngblood," Jenkins said, unruffled. "I'm simply a concerned citizen doing my civic duty." The marshal looked between the two men, clearly trying to assess who was telling the truth. "Mr. Jenkins, would you be willing to sign a sworn statement about what you witnessed?" "Of course," Jenkins replied readily. "Anything to help justice be served." Thomas knew he was in serious trouble. Jenkins's testimony provided the motive and threat the marshal had been looking for. Combined with the saloon girl's statement, it might be enough to have him arrested and taken back to Colorado for trial. "Sheriff," Thomas appealed to Dawson, "you know what kind of man Jenkins is. He's been trying to get the Callaway land for years. This is just his latest tactic." Dawson looked troubled but shook his head. "It's not my jurisdiction, Youngblood. The marshal has to follow the evidence where it leads." The marshal nodded grimly. "Thomas Youngblood, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of James Watterson. You'll be held here until arrangements can be made to transport you to Colorado for trial." As the deputy moved to take Thomas's gun and escort him to a cell, the door burst open again. This time it was Beatrice who entered, followed by her father. "Stop this at once," she demanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. "Thomas Youngblood is innocent, and I can prove it." The marshal turned to her with impatience. "Miss, this is no place for I have evidence," she interrupted. "Evidence that proves Mr. Youngblood could not have killed James Watterson on the morning in question." This got everyone's attention. The marshal motioned for the deputy to wait. "What evidence?" Beatrice pulled a letter from her reticule. "This is a telegram sent from Laramie, Wyoming, to the ranch where Mr. Youngblood was working at the time. It confirms his arrival there on the morning that Mr. Watterson was supposedly killed, a morning when he would have still been in Silverton if he had committed the crime." She handed the telegram to the marshal, who examined it closely. It was dated, as Beatrice had said, the same day as Watterson's murder, and clearly indicated that Thomas had arrived safely in Laramie, a journey of at least 2 days from Silverton. "Where did you get this?" the marshal demanded. "From Mr. Youngblood's belongings," Beatrice admitted. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Thomas, but when I heard the accusations, I remembered you mentioned keeping correspondence from previous employers." Thomas was too stunned to be upset about the invasion of privacy. "I had forgotten about that telegram. My former employer was expecting me and had sent that confirmation to the ranch owner when I arrived." The marshal frowned, comparing the date on the telegram to his notes. "If this is authentic, it would indeed make it impossible for you to have been in Silverton when Watterson was killed." Jenkins's face had darkened with anger. "That telegram could easily be forged." "It could," the marshal agreed, "but that can be verified by contacting the telegraph office in Laramie. And if it is authentic, Mr. Jenkins, it would make your statement not just mistaken but deliberately false. That's a serious offense." Jenkins sputtered, but before he could form a coherent response, Harold Callaway stepped forward. "There's something else you should know, Marshal," he said gravely. "Thomas Youngblood saved my life during the war. We were on opposite sides, he Confederate, me Union, but when I was separated from my unit and came under fire, he risked himself to pull me to safety. I didn't recognize him when he first came to our farm, but as we worked together, memories started coming back. When Beatrice told me about this trouble, it all finally clicked into place." Thomas stared at Harold in amazement. "You knew all this time?" Harold smiled faintly. "Not at first, but gradually. The eyes don't change, son, even when everything else does. And you still have that same look when you're concentrating hard on something, like when you're taking aim, whether with a gun or a plow." The revelation left Thomas speechless. All this time he had thought Harold didn't remember him, when in fact the older man had been quietly putting the pieces together. The marshal looked between them, then back at the telegram. "I'll need to verify this," he said finally. "But if it checks out, you're free to go, Youngblood." He turned a hard gaze on Jenkins. "And you and I will have a different conversation." Jenkins, seeing his plan unraveling, retreated toward the door. "This is all a misunderstanding. I must have been confused about the dates. If you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." "Your business can wait," Sheriff Dawson said firmly, blocking his path. "You'll stay right here until we get to the bottom of this." As Jenkins reluctantly took a seat, the marshal set about sending telegrams to verify Beatrice's evidence. The process would take time, but for the first time since the lawman had arrived at the farm, Thomas felt hope returning. Beatrice moved to stand beside him, close enough that their hands brushed. "I told you we believe in you," she said softly. "Thank you," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. I don't know how to repay such faith." Harold clapped him on the shoulder. "No repayment needed. We're just balancing the scales as you've been doing for us." The three of them waited together as the hours passed, united in a way that transcended business partnership or even friendship. By nightfall, the marshal had received confirmation from Laramie the telegram was authentic, and the ranch owner there remembered Thomas's arrival clearly, as it had coincided with an important cattle sale. "It seems I owe you an apology, Mr. Youngblood," the marshal said stiffly. "You're free to go. We'll continue our investigation into Watterson's death elsewhere." As for Jenkins, the lawmen were less forgiving. His false testimony was a serious matter, and while he protested that it was merely a mistake, the calculated nature of his lie was evident to all. He was facing charges of his own now, a stunning reversal of fortune that left him sputtering with indignation as the deputy escorted him to a cell. "This isn't over," Jenkins warned Thomas as he was led away. "You may have won today, but I'll see that farm in my hands yet." Thomas didn't dignify the threat with a response. Instead, he turned to Beatrice and Harold. "Let's go home," he said simply. The ride back to the farm was quiet, each of them processing the events of the day. It was only when they reached the farmhouse, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, that Thomas finally found words for what he was feeling. "I came here to repay a debt," he said to Harold as they dismounted. "But I've found something I never expected." "And what's that?" Harold asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already had an idea. Thomas's eyes moved to Beatrice, who was watching him with an expression that made his heart race. "A chance at the life I always wanted but never thought I deserved." Harold nodded, understanding completely. "Well, I'm an old man who needs his rest after all this excitement. Think I'll turn in early." With a meaningful glance between Thomas and his daughter, he headed inside, leaving them alone in the yard. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Beatrice took a step toward Thomas. "When I thought they might take you away," she said softly, "I realized something." "What's that?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to hope. "That the farm would feel empty without you, even if Pa and I worked it successfully for years to come." She took another step closer. "It wasn't just the help you've given us or the partnership you formed with Pa. It was you, Thomas. You've become essential to the farm and to me." Thomas reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "I've loved you since that day in town when you stood tall despite their laughter," he admitted. "Every day since has only deepened that feeling." "They laughed when you chose me," Beatrice remembered, a smile playing at her lips. "And you said they'd see why you did." "You see why now?" Thomas asked. Instead of answering with words, Beatrice leaned forward and kissed him a kiss that spoke of newfound courage, of barriers finally broken, of a future they would build together. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably ask your father's permission properly," he murmured. Beatrice laughed softly. "I think he gave it when he conveniently went to bed at sunset. But yes, you should ask him tomorrow. He'll appreciate the gesture." "And you?" Thomas asked, suddenly uncertain despite the kiss they'd shared. "What would your answer be if I were to ask a certain question?" Beatrice's eyes shone in the gathering twilight. "Ask me and find out." Thomas took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee, still holding her hands in his. "Beatrice Callaway, I came here to repay a debt, but I found my future instead. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." As they sealed their engagement with another kiss, the farm around them seemed to glow with promised land that would flourish under their care. A home that would echo with love and perhaps, someday, the laughter of children. The path ahead would not be without challenges, but they would face them together, bound by a love that had defied expectations and prejudices. In Willow Creek, they had laughed when Thomas chose Beatrice. But now, as the stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, it was clear to both of them why he had. Spring arrived with gentle rains that transformed the Callaway, now the Callaway Youngblood farm, into a tapestry of green. The wedding had been a simple affair in late winter, attended by a surprisingly large number of townsfolk who had, over time, come to respect the unlikely partnership that had revitalized one of the oldest farms in the valley. Jenkins had been conspicuously absent, having sold his holdings and moved further west after his failed attempt to frame Thomas had backfired, leaving his reputation in tatters. The cattle baron's departure had created opportunities for smaller ranchers and farmers, restoring a balance to the community that many felt was long overdue. Thomas and Beatrice worked side by side through the planting season, their partnership in life as seamless as their partnership in labor. Harold, whose health had improved significantly, took on the role of advisor, sharing decades of farming wisdom while allowing the younger couple to make the farm their own. On a particularly fine May morning, Thomas found Beatrice in the kitchen garden, planting the herbs she used for both cooking and medicinal purposes. The sight of her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, hands in the soil, humming softly to herself filled him with a contentment he had never known in his previous life. "You look happy," he observed, leaning against the garden fence. Beatrice looked up, smiling at her husband of 3 months. "I am happy, aren't you? More than I ever thought possible," he admitted, entering the garden to kneel beside her. "But I was thinking." "A dangerous pastime," she teased, continuing to plant her seedlings. Thomas chuckled. "Perhaps. But I was thinking that this farm, as much as I love it, is just a beginning." Beatrice set down her trowel, giving him her full attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean that life keeps moving forward. The war divided this country, but now railroads and telegraph lines are connecting it again. The world is changing rapidly, and we should be part of that change." "You're being very philosophical this morning," Beatrice observed. "What brought this on?" Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a letter. "This came yesterday. I didn't want to mention it until I'd thought it through." Beatrice took the letter, noting that it bore the letterhead of the Western Union Telegraph Company. As she read, her eyes widened. "They're offering you a position as a security consultant for their new lines." Thomas nodded. "They need someone who knows the territories, who can advise them on safe routes and potential trouble spots. It would mean some travel, but nothing too extensive or dangerous. And the pay is good, very good." "But what about the farm?" Beatrice asked, looking around at the land they had worked so hard to revitalize. "The farm remains our home and our foundation," Thomas assured her. "But this position would provide additional income, security for our future, for the family we hope to have someday." Beatrice's cheeks colored slightly at this reference to their shared hope for children. "You've given this a lot of thought." "I have," Thomas admitted, "and I wouldn't consider it if I thought it would take me away from you for long periods. The company has assured me that most of the work can be done from here, with occasional trips to survey new routes or address specific concerns." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she looked up at her husband with a smile. "I think you should accept. You have unique knowledge and experience that could be valuable to them, and as you said, we should be part of building this new world, not just watching it happen around us." Thomas leaned forward to kiss her gently. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's something else, too." "What's that?" "The company is also interested in establishing a telegraph office here in Willow Creek. Currently, the nearest one is 20 miles away. They've asked if we might be willing to allocate a small portion of our land near the road for such a purpose." Beatrice's eyes lit up with excitement. "That would be wonderful for the town, and for us. Imagine having direct communication with the outside world right here." "My thoughts exactly," Thomas agreed. "I told them I'd discuss it with you and your father before giving an answer." "Pa will be thrilled," Beatrice predicted. "He's always said this valley needs to join the modern age if it's going to prosper." As if summoned by their conversation, Harold appeared at the garden gate, his cane now used more from habit than necessity. "Are you two planning to work today, or just talk away the morning?" he called, his tone belying the sternness of his words. Thomas rose, helping Beatrice to her feet. "Actually, sir, we have something to discuss with you, a proposition that might interest you." Together, they explained the telegraph company's offer. Harold listened attentively, his weathered face thoughtful. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment before breaking into a broad smile. "Well, it seems our partnership continues to bring unexpected benefits," he said. "I think it's an excellent opportunity both for you, Thomas, and for our community. You don't mind part of the farm being used for the telegraph office?" Beatrice asked. Harold shook his head. "Mind, I'm delighted. That corner plot by the main road has never been much good for farming anyway, too rocky, but it's perfect for a building that needs to be accessible to the town." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude for the open-mindedness of his father-in-law. "Then, I'll write back accepting both offers." "Good, good," Harold nodded. "Now, with that settled, I believe we still have work to do before sundown." As they returned to their respective tasks, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come in less than a year. From a struggling farm on the verge of bankruptcy, to a thriving enterprise with promising connections to the wider world. From a man with a dangerous reputation, to a respected member of the community with a loving family and purposeful work. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Beatrice leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "If I hadn't heard your father's name in town that day, if I hadn't recognized it. If you hadn't been brave enough to approach us despite the town's ridicule," Beatrice added. Thomas smiled, remembering the laughter that had followed his first expression of interest in the Callaway farm and in Beatrice herself. "I've never regretted it, not for a moment." "They laughed when you chose me," Beatrice mused, echoing the words that had become a private touchstone between them. "But I think even they understand now." "Some things are worth being laughed at for," Thomas said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and drawing her closer. "Some things are worth everything." As darkness settled over the Montana Valley, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their plans for the farm, for the telegraph office, for their future together. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, and somewhere an owl hooted softly, the familiar sounds of a land that had become home in the truest sense of the word. Inside, Harold had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire, a book of poetry open on his lap, a man at peace with his life, and the legacy he would leave in the capable hands of his daughter, and the son-in-law who had once saved his life and had now helped save his farm. The journey had been unexpected for all of them, filled with challenges and revelations, but as Thomas and Beatrice finally rose to go inside, their hands linked and their hearts full, they knew that the best of their story was still unfolding, a story of love that had defied expectations and flourished against all odds in the wild heart of the American West. 5 years later, the Callaway Youngblood farm had become one of the most prosperous in the region. The telegraph office at the corner of their property served as a vital link between Willow Creek and the wider world, bringing news and opportunities that had transformed the once isolated community. Thomas's work with the telegraph company had expanded to include security consulting for the railroad as well, providing a steady income that complemented the farm's increasing yields. But the greatest joy in Thomas and Beatrice's life was their family. 3-year-old William Harold Youngblood, named for both Beatrice's father and Thomas's, was the spitting image of his father but with his mother's thoughtful disposition. And 6-month-old Emma Grace had her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined nature. On a bright September morning, as Beatrice nursed Emma on the porch while William played with wooden blocks at her feet, she spotted a rider approaching on the road from town. She recognized the familiar figure of her husband long before he reached the gate, his straight-backed posture and confident seat in the saddle unmistakable even at a distance. "Look, William," she said to her son, Papa's coming home early today." The boy scrambled to his feet, abandoning his blocks to run to the gate, bouncing with excitement as he waited for his father. Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, scooping his son into his arms before the boy could even call out a greeting. "There's my little deputy," Thomas said, tossing William into the air and catching him securely, eliciting peals of laughter. "Have you been helping Mama while I was away?" "Yes," William declared proudly. "I fed the chickens all by myself." "He did," Beatrice confirmed as Thomas carried their son back to the porch. "Though we lost a fair amount of feed to enthusiastic scattering." Thomas laughed, leaning down to kiss his wife and gently stroke Emma's downy head. The chickens probably appreciated the extra effort. He settled onto the porch swing beside Beatrice, with William wriggling onto his lap. "How's your father today?" "Better," Beatrice said. "Dr. Lewis says the new treatment is working. Pa was even talking about riding into town next week for the Harvest Festival." Harold, now in his 60s, had suffered a bout of pneumonia the previous winter that had left him weakened, but his stubborn resilience, a trait he had passed to his daughter, had seen him through the worst of it. "That's good news," Thomas said sincerely. "The festival won't be the same without him judging the corn contest." "Speaking of the festival," Beatrice said, adjusting Emma to her shoulder to pat the baby's back, "Mrs. Peterson stopped by earlier. She's organizing the committee this year and wants to know if you'll lead the shooting exhibition again." Thomas's expression softened with reminiscence. 5 years ago, a shooting exhibition brought us together. Seems fitting to continue the tradition." "It does," Beatrice agreed. "Though this time, I hope no one laughs when you choose to escort me home afterward." Thomas chuckled. "I think they've long since stopped laughing. In fact, from what I hear in town these days, people consider me the luckiest man in the territory." "Are you, Papa?" William asked, looking up with the innocent curiosity of childhood. "Are you the luckiest man?" Thomas met Beatrice's eyes over their son's head, the love between them as strong and clear as it had been on the day he proposed. "Yes, William, I am. And someday, when you're older, I'll tell you exactly why." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, and Harold had retired to his room with a new book from the lending library Thomas had helped establish in Willow Creek, husband and wife sat together by the fire, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "I received a letter today," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From the railroad company. They've offered me a more permanent position overseeing security for the entire Northwestern Division." Beatrice looked up from her sewing. "That sounds like an important job." "It is," Thomas acknowledged, "and it would mean more money, more security for our future." "But," Beatrice prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but it would also mean more time away from home, from you and the children." Thomas stared into the fire, his expression troubled. "I told them I needed to discuss it with you before giving an answer." Beatrice set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "What do you want, Thomas? Not what you think is best for us, or what makes the most practical sense. What does your heart tell you?" Thomas squeezed her hand gratefully. "My heart tells me that I've spent enough of my life traveling and facing dangers, that the greatest adventure and the most meaningful work is right here, with you and our children, building something that will last beyond us." "Then that's your answer," Beatrice said simply. "We have everything we need, Thomas. The farm is prosperous, your current work with the telegraph company provides well for us, and most importantly, we have each other and our family." Thomas drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How did I get so fortunate to find a woman who understands me so completely?" "It wasn't fortune," Beatrice replied with a smile. It was courage yours in seeing beyond appearances and mine in trusting that you meant what you said when everyone else doubted. They sat together in companionable silence for a while longer, watching the flames dance in the hearth, each lost in their own thoughts, yet perfectly attuned to the other's presence. "Do you remember," Thomas said eventually, "the day Jenkins and his men came to the farm demanding payment of your father's loan?" "Of course," Beatrice nodded. "I was terrified we would lose everything." "I knew then," Thomas admitted. "That was the moment I knew for certain that I loved you, when you stood your ground despite your fear, when you refused to be intimidated." Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I knew when you faced those lawmen without flinching, when you maintained your innocence even as evidence seemed stacked against you. I knew then that my heart was already yours." "We've come a long way since those days," Thomas mused. "We have," Beatrice agreed. "But the journey's not over yet." Thomas smiled, drawing her closer still. "No, it's not, and I can't wait to see where it takes us next." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, drumming softly on the roof of the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life within it, filled with love, respect, and shared purpose. The challenges they had faced had only strengthened their bond, and the future, while uncertain as all futures must be, held the promise of continued growth and deepening connections. In Willow Creek, people still sometimes told the story of the day Thomas Youngblood chose Beatrice Callaway, of the laughter that had followed, and his confident assertion that they would see why he did. It had become something of a local legend, embellished with each retelling but true at its heart, a story of looking beyond surfaces to see the real worth of a person, of finding value where others saw only limitations. But for Thomas and Beatrice, it wasn't legend or folklore. It was simply the beginning of their truth, the first chapter in a continuing story written day by day through choices large and small, through struggles and triumphs, through the quiet moments of understanding that formed the foundation of a love as enduring as the land they nurtured together. As the rain fell and the fire burned low, they remained together on the settle, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, not perfection, but completion, not escape, but home, not an ending, but a beginning that renewed itself with each passing day in the wild, beautiful heart of the American frontier.